Welcome everyone to our Christianity and Patriotism webinar. For those of you who are just joining an American Values Coalition event for the first time, we were formed in 2021 to address the problems of hyperpolarization, political extremism, and misinformation, and threats to democracy, especially as they happen in red America, and to address those problems as conservatives speaking to our fellow conservatives about the problems that are happening within our own tent. If you are a pastor, we have a special program for you called J29 Coalition, which you can find out more about at j29coalition.com. And J29 Coalition is to help you disciple your congregation in kingdom-shaped politics. This year, we'll have a J29 cohort, which will include 2 in-person retreats and then 8 virtual sessions. One of those in-person retreats is a trip to the U.S.-Mexico border that was added this year and are especially excited about. So head to j29coalition.com to learn more about that if you are a pastor. If you know a pastor, tell them about it and where they can get more information about J29. So I'm excited about our topic today. Our 2 speakers, hopefully 2 speakers, are Richard Mouw and Adam Taylor. Dr. Richard Mouw is former president of Fuller Seminary. Formerly, he was president of Fuller Seminary, and now he is senior research fellow at the Henry Institute for the Study of Religion and Politics at Calvin University. And he is the author of How to Be a Patriotic Christian, Love of Country as Love of Neighbor, and Reverend Adam Taylor, who is president of Sojourners and previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as vice president of advocacy at World Vision. And he is the author of A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. They wrote other books, but these are the books that's related to our topic. So we are going to pivot a little based upon our technical difficulties. And I'm going to have Adam Taylor go first to talk about this question of patriotism appropriate for a Christian and what are the perils and or benefits. Adam Taylor will speak for 15 minutes. Then hopefully we'll have Richard Mouw on by then, and he'll give his answer to these questions. Then we will have time for some follow-up questions from me, and then also time for audience questions, which we're going to use the Q&A. You'll see not the chat, but the Q&A button at the bottom we'll use for those audience questions. Adam Taylor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Nat. Grateful to be with you. Do hope that Dr. Richard Mouw was able to join us. Good to be with all of you virtually. Grateful for the work of the American Values Coalition and appreciate the chance to reflect on a topic that seems particularly timely right now, both because of some of the perils we're seeing in our nation and the church and in our country's democracy, but also it strikes me that this conversation is taking place in between last week's celebration of Juneteenth, where many of us, now that it's been declared a national holiday, celebrated the moment when Union's troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, 2.5 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And it took that amount of time before those who were enslaved in Galveston were able to experience their freedom, because it required the Union troops to be able to enable that freedom to become real. And to me, Juneteenth is both a holiday where we have to reckon with some of that ugly truths of our past, but it's also just about generally celebrating that joyous moment and the kind of ongoing journey and struggle of freedom in this country that I think is very precious. And then, of course, next week we are celebrating our nation's birthday on Independence Day. It is a day when many of us fly the American flag and there are fireworks, and for good reason. As Americans, we celebrate our nation. And I think as we approach Independence Day, it's important to grapple with this question about whether is patriotism appropriate for a Christian? What are the perils and what are the benefits? Now, I'll just give you my spoiler alert. My quick answer to that question is that Christians can be, and in many cases should be, patriotic. But my answer is complicated by the ways in which, like many terms that are kind of bandied about within our politics today, patriotism has also become a very loaded word, and it really depends on how we define and understand patriotism. We can have a very healthy form of patriotism that is tied to a healthy love of our country. But we can also have, and have had throughout our history, a very poisonous form of patriotism that is often tied to various forms of nationalism. And I'll speak more to that danger. Should have mentioned earlier that, as Matt mentioned, I have the honor of serving as the president of Sojourners. We are an ecumenical Christian organization that has a publication arm. You can learn more about that at sojo.net. We also have an advocacy arm that works on a range of issues, from trying to strengthen and protect our democracy to economic justice to immigrant rights and so much more. And I'm certainly happy to talk more about our work and mission in the Q&A portion tonight. All too often, healthy love of one's country, or patriotism, can seep into a pernicious love of blood and soil, which is kind of my shorthand definition of nationalism. With the latter, i.e., nationalism, being marked by a sense of superiority, domination, and ethnocentrism. A Christianity that truly puts God first must never wrap the cross in the flag. Instead, we must embrace our constitutional commitment to religious freedom, which I believe, and I think history has shown, has enabled religion, including Christianity, to flourish in our nation. As individuals, and for those of us that are a part of the church, we are called to put our first and primary obedience to God and our belief in the liberating teachings and life of Jesus Christ ahead of any earthly loyalty. That includes even our loyalty to our country or to a political party or even to a particular politician. This means that we shape our political convictions based on our understanding of the best way to follow the moral convictions and teachings of our faith, and not the other way around. We must seek to avoid ways in which so often this kind of core belief that is woven into the DNA of this nation, that we are a chosen or an innocent nation, that often can lead to an unhealthy version of patriotism. Because when we believe that our nation is chosen, that can easily lead to a sense of superiority. It can lead to a commitment to dominate the rest of the world, rather than to be an agent for good in the world. But I also reject an understanding within our faith that could say that we shouldn't love our nation. While John 3:16 makes it clear that God's love is for the entire world, expressing a love for our own country can be both healthy and very important. For instance, just making this very personal, I love America's growing and incredible racial and ethnic diversity. I actually think that is one of our nation's superpowers. I love the sheer breadth and beauty of our nation's landscape. I love our ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit. I love so many of our art forms and forms of music, and so much more. But most of all, I love the ideals that I think help make this nation brilliant and unique. The ideal, the notion that we are all created equal and are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And loving these ideals means working tirelessly to make them a reality for everyone. Ultimately, I believe that our patriotism as Christians should always be rooted in a love that seeks to overcome evil with good. Thus, instead of rejecting patriotism, I think we as Christians are called to redeem it. Instead of a patriotism that is rooted in ethno-nationalism, I want to live out a love for our country that refuses to demonize my opponents, that rejects an us versus them mentality that has sadly seized so much of our politics today, and embraces a commitment to push forward this ongoing project that always remains unfinished of ensuring that liberty and justice for all, which is our creedal promise as a country, often rooted in our core religious convictions and beliefs, is a reality for everyone. I yearn for a real contest of ideas and plans and visions for how we can make that creedal promise real and accessible for everyone. And that, to me, is what patriotism is all about. I also think it's really important to make the point that it is kind of counterproductive to get into a kind of argument over who loves our country more. We might have different ways of loving our country, but one way that we can love our country is by critiquing our country, by trying to hold our country accountable to its own ideals, ideals that we have often woefully fallen short of achieving. And so, in some ways, protest, for example, can be a form of patriotism, particularly when it is done out of a motivation to remake our country into that ideal. Instead, nationalism, in contrast, is often rooted in a revisionist and censor telling of our history, and is often fueled by hatred and a fear of the other. Instead, a healthy form of patriotism, particularly from a Christian theological perspective, should always be tied to the great commandment to love our God with all of our mind, body, and soul, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We should tie our sense of patriotism and root it in the Beatitudes of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, a series of core values that often feel quite countercultural in our politics today. And so I want to close by just making the argument that how we understand patriotism and how we redeem it, how we have a healthy form of patriotism, is also tied to how we have a healthy understanding of how, as Christians, we engage in our politics. I think those two things are inextricably linked. And I just want to share a little bit from a statement that a very diverse cross-section of Christians from various traditions, from evangelical to mainline to Catholic to Black church and beyond, came together about 2 years ago and created a statement that's called a call to civic discipleship. We gathered together because we became kind of exasperated that so often the Christian engagement in politics was being overshadowed by two extreme versions. One extreme version weaponizes our Christian faith and essentially makes our faith a proxy, or makes our partisan loyalties a proxy for our faith. It makes our partisan and ideological commitments more important than our shared identity in Christ. The other extreme, somewhat in reaction to the weaponization of our faith, makes the argument that the solution then is to just disengage from politics altogether. Makes the argument that by engaging in politics, we are simply going to corrupt our faith. And I would argue that neither are faithful to our Christian ethic and our Christian tradition. That there is a third way that we desperately need, where we call Christians to be salt and light in our politics. We call Christians to embrace a healthier form of patriotism, if you will. And we developed a whole series of core principles that really speak to the how we engage in politics, so that we can engage in ways that are transformational, that are aligned with our core Christian values. And I'll just mention them really quickly. We can talk more about them in the Q&A, but one is to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit from Galatians 5:22 and 23, where the Apostle Paul lists these fruits. This fruit is love, joy, peace, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And again, I know that these do not sound like what is the core operating set of values in our politics today, but I actually think these should be embraced and applied to our politics, and we desperately need more of them. We should resist an us versus them thinking that I mentioned earlier. We should confront any appeals to violence with a deep commitment to nonviolence. Political violence is anathema to our Christian faith. And too often we are seeing this kind of ends justifies the means mentality that I also think is quite destructive. We should constantly seek truth, particularly in an age when that is so much harder to do with the power of social media and the ways in which so many of us are getting our information and our quote unquote truth from very fragmented or very narrow media systems or media sources. We should exercise prudence. We should embrace a long-term view. Our actions and decisions do have profound impacts on the livelihood and prospects of future generations. We should be engaged in politics, but never used by politics. We should be political, but never overly partisan. We should be principled, but not overly ideological. And we should be firm, but civil. One of my favorite quotes by the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was when he described the vocation of the church. And he said, the church at its best is called not to be the master or the servant of the state, but to be the conscience of the state. And I think unhealthy patriotism combined with our Christian faith tries to make our politics, essentially make the church the master of our politics. And unfortunately, that can lead us down a very seductive and tempting path that ultimately leads to idolatry. Instead, we should be that conscience that seeks to transform our politics according to our Christian values. And yes, we can disagree and will disagree about how to apply the messiness of our politics to the values of our faith, or vice versa, apply our values to the messiness of our politics. But we should have the tools based on many core and shared Christian values to be able to have those hard conversations. I'll end with this. Many of you know that this coming year, we as a nation are going to be celebrating our quincentennial. That's our 250th birthday as a country. And I think it actually gives us an incredible opportunity and responsibility to redeem how we understand patriotism. This 250th birthday could either simply exacerbate our existing polarization as we get into fights over who loves the country more, or we get into a fight between those who often are kind of overly engaged in self-loathing and a rejection of America's greatness and goodness versus those who simply want to glorify that goodness without any critique whatsoever. Instead, I would love to see us celebrate this 250th birthday by reckoning with some of the ways in which we've fallen short of our core creedal civic ideals and how we can celebrate how we're still on this journey of ultimately making our nation into a more perfect union, of truly extending liberty and justice for all, which I truly believe almost all Americans want to embrace. And so that, I guess, is my challenge as I end my opening remarks. And I'll just close with the words of the prophet Isaiah, who reminds us that the credibility of our faith is not measured by religious ritual, but how we seek justice and defend the most vulnerable. In Isaiah 1:17, the prophet says, "Take your evil deeds out of my sight, doing wrong. Learn to do right, seek justice, and defend the oppressed."
Thank you, Adam. So Emily is going to be our stand-in for Dr. Moore, who's on the phone.
Okay. I want to talk about, I want to say to start with that I've had to struggle toward an affirmation of patriotism. My youth as a graduate student, university campuses, I got very involved in the anti-war movement for racial justice. And there were times when we would be doing some kind of demonstration or a march that people would hold up signs saying, "America, love it or leave it." And I didn't want to leave it, but I was having a hard time loving it as well. And for a long time, I had some difficulties, even in my adult life, where I was in positions where I had to go along with patriotic exercises. With the Friday night after 9/11, my wife and I were at a concert at the Hollywood Bowl. And they start off, it's dark, and they have a great spotlight on the American flag, and they do the national anthem. And I found myself crying that night. And then out of a real affection for the flag and for the United States. Then I had to struggle with this question, really basic question about patriotism. Is it okay to love your own nation in a very special way, kind of a special affection for your own nation? I was talking to an evangelical friend who really didn't like the idea of patriotism at all. And he said, we got to love all people as people and not have any special affections for any specific nation. Well, the guy was wearing a Dodger shirt, and so I said, yeah, I feel that way about baseball too. That you shouldn't have a favorite team. Just love all teams, all baseball players, and cheer everybody on. And he said, "Mouw, you're perverse," but there is a point to that. And in fact, the words that we use for patriotism, the fatherland, that comes from the word father. We often do talk about the fatherland. We talk about the motherland. And there's an analogy of patriotism to the love of parents. I did care about my mother more than the mother next door. I even one time bought my mother a card that said, "You're the greatest mother on the face of the earth." Well, she really wasn't, but it's kind of hyperbole. The problem of saying you're the greatest nation on the face of the earth is that the difference between my mother and the United States is my mother didn't have bombs and other weapons to challenge any other mother who thought that she was the greatest mother, that kind of thing. So we do have to be careful with this image. And we also know that families can be dysfunctional and nations can be dysfunctional. But you know, that image of that parental image as it applies to the nation and to political leadership is found in the Bible. Isaiah 60 has a verse that's really a good verse. But if you were preaching on it, you probably would not put it on your bulletin board. It says that God's people should suck the breasts of kings. The early Presbyterians in Scotland picked up on that image, and they talked about the importance of kings being nursing fathers. And you know, it's an interesting image because it points to the fact that in the Bible, government is meant to nurture us, not just to have a negative role of keeping anything bad to happen to us, but that it also has a certain kind of nurturing function. That Psalm 72 says, "Give the king thy justice, O Lord. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people." And then it has this wonderful image that kind of king who defends the cause of the poor and dispenses justice. His rule will be, and then this wonderful image, like rain falling upon the newly mown grass, promoting growth, nurturing the land. And there's something important about that. And we need to keep that in mind when we think about when we're loving our country and having affection for our country. What do we want from it? Well, we want a kind of nurturing. We don't just want oppression. We don't want everybody being deported. We want a government that's willing to nurture those within its borders. And of course, patriotism can be very dangerous. Adam has already referred to this. I mean, you can come to have an idolatrous affection for your nation. And even when it doesn't become completely idolatrous, you can have a kind of uncritical, my country right or wrong kind of thing. And so we need to think as Christians, how do we have an affection, proper affection and love of our country without getting into idolatry and uncritical acceptance of the status quo? And the remedy, of course, is exactly what Adam was just talking about. It's a question of identity. Because I love America. But my identity as an American is not what defines me. What defines me, nicely captured in the great hymn in Revelation 5, where the heavenly courts sing to the Lamb. Worthy art thou, O Lord. Thou wast slain. By thy blood thou didst ransom men and women for God from every tribe and tongue and nation, and has made us a kingdom and priests unto our God. I won't go into the details of how this happened, but I went to North Korea on a kind of a mercy mission with a Korean businessman who wanted to bring some food to some starving villages in the very northern part of North Korea. The government let him come, and he invited me to go with him. And on Sunday, to our surprise in Pyongyang, we were invited. The government said they would take us to a Christian worship service, one of 4 services, they said, in the Pyongyang area that were legal. And it was a good service. And as we walked in, the North Korean choir, was singing, "Jesus paid it all." I mean, in Korean, but Jesus paid it all to him I owe. And but about halfway through the service, the choir sang, "What a friend we have in Jesus." And I have a picture of this. In the front row of the choir, wearing old Presbyterian robes that had been left behind by missionaries, in the front row, there was a young woman who was singing. And when she got to that verse that says, Are we weak and heavy laden, burdened with a load of care? Jesus knows our every weakness. Do thy friends despise, forsake thee? Take it to the Lord in prayer. And there were tears streaming down her cheek. And I was very moved by that. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I think the Spirit was speaking to me. That I'm not a tourist here watching some other culture. This is a family visit. This is my sister in Jesus Christ. And I've never forgotten that. I pray for that woman every once in a while because her tears were tears that were pleasing to Jesus. And I can never think of North Korea simply in hostile terms. I have to think that there's a choir in Pyongyang that talks about loving Jesus and believing that he paid it all of our sins were on the cross. And that's very important for us to have both an affection for our own nation, but a love of the kingdom of Jesus Christ from every tribe and tongue and people and nation of the earth, because the Lamb of God is doing something new these days, an extension of Pentecost. Something new is happening. And we're preparing for a day when we will gather from every tribe and tongue and nation, Revelation 7. Sing praises to the Lamb, the victory of the Lamb before the throne. That's what defines us. And so I always need to think of my brothers and sisters in Christ around the world when I'm thinking about American policies and like. I mean, Iran has a Christian community. When we bomb them, we're possibly bombing Christian churches. Anyway, this is very, very important. The identity question. And how do we handle that? Well, I find a marvelous piece of guidance in 1 Peter 2, the 17th verse, where the apostle gives 4 commands to these Gentiles and Jews. He says, you are to honor all human beings, and you are to love the brotherhood. You are to fear God, and you're to honor the emperor. It's interesting there that our relationship with a non-Christian community around the world and in our own government is honor. The Greek word there is timao. It means have regard for the well-being of, wanting them to flourish, honoring all human beings, whether they're believers or not, and honoring the government and honoring God's call to government. But at the same time, we got to love the church. And the verb there is agapao. It's agape love, a very, very intense affection for the body of Jesus Christ here and abroad. And we need to fear the Lord. Phobeo is the verb there. So fearing the Lord is more important than honoring the emperor. And loving the church is more important than honoring all human beings. But we need to keep those together. And there is a kind of affection, a desire to promote the well-being of all human beings, and a desire to even have government that often appears to be godless, called to do the right kinds of things. And that's where Adam was right, that we need to think about the proper way of honoring government, and that wonderful image of his of people of God as the conscience of the nation. And we need to maintain that conscience. That's enough for me.
Thank you, Rich. I'm just going to launch a quick poll right now for those in the audience, just to get the sense of where everyone's at. And, Adam pointed out that this is a topic that has been there's been a renewed interest in this topic. And so I just wanted to point out as well, it's not just a renewed interest within Christianity. There's a renewed interest more broadly in the topic of patriotism. So, for instance, I would point you to Jill Lepore's book, This America, The Case for the Nation. I think both Adam and Rich had cited this book in their books. There's also Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes by Stephen Smith. Just to show you that, there are where there is some interest outside of Christianity as well on this topic. So for the audience, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Before I start asking my questions, I just wanted to give an opportunity if Adam has any questions for Rich, or if Rich has any questions for Adam.
Nat, let me just say that several years ago there was a Pew. They surveyed young Muslims in the United States, and they found that many young Muslims, teenagers and a little older, were resentful of their local leaders for constantly trying to get them to be loyal to their country of origin. And they wanted to be American Muslims, and they wanted to honor America. And I think it would be a wonderful thing if we could find ways to bring Christian teenagers and Muslim teenagers thinking about how do we, as people of strong convictions, have an affection for America. Anyway.
Well put.
I'll just say really quickly, Richard, thank you for what you shared. And I really loved your kind of analogy of a nation as a parent and the kind of affection you have for a parent. It made me think that there are ways in which our nation has and continues to hurt many people, you know, from immigrants to the experience of the Black community, which is certainly close to my heart and my experience. And yet, at least in the Black community, I've found some of the deepest forms of patriotism. I mean, you have some of the highest degrees of enlistment in the military within the Black community. You have many Black families that continue to have the American flag displayed prominently. Not all, I don't want to overgeneralize. But the reason I'm sharing this is that, you know, you can still love something even if it has disappointed you, even if it's hurt you. And so I think there's a dimension of that too that's important here. And you know, I really believe in a Christ that can make all things new. So one of the things that I wrote about in my book is that I feel like we're in desperate need of what I would call, and many other scholars like Eddie Glott and others have called for, which is a fourth founding of our nation. And it's not to do it a disservice to our original founding. That's important to celebrate. We have the quincentennial coming up. But if you think about our history, you know, we had a first founding that obviously had a fatal flaw in it because it did not treat everyone as equal and denied rights, voting rights to anyone except land-owning white men. And then we had a second founding after the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the period of Reconstruction. But then that was ended with a betrayal. And then we had a third founding with the struggle and victories of the Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act. And then that resulted in a backlash and the Southern strategy. And I would argue the religious right was very much born out of that period. And so we fast forward another 50 years, and I think we're kind of in this moment, an inflection moment, with a lot of peril, certainly, but also the real potential and maybe the need for kind of a fourth founding. And to me, that is also connected to this whole conversation about patriotism. So I just want to put that on the table, but also want to thank you for this kind of connection between, you know, understanding of nation and parent.
So what, as y'all both, well, as Adam talked about, we're sort of in an interesting time for this conversation. Both of you have talked about the benefits of patriotism. I mean, when you look out at the nation right now, a lot of the folks who seem most outwardly patriotic, or at least some of them, are also supporting things that are in direct contradiction to some core American values, like due process rights, freedom of speech, religious freedom. So, I mean, if there's some benefits to patriotism, why aren't those benefits? They don't seem to be impacting some certain folks who are out there, not maybe outwardly patriotic, but not supporting some very core American values. Does that question make sense?
I think that what you're pointing to is a failure of the church. Or 4th of July is coming up, and I know pastors who will say, dread 4th of July. I dread Memorial Day because my people want all this patriotic stuff, and I just try to ignore it, but it happens. Well, I think this patriotic stuff ought to be addressed, and I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff there. You know, if some people insist on seeing America the Beautiful on the 4th of July, then I would say, let's look at that. or God bless America on the 4th of July. Yeah, God bless America and shed his grace on America. And God's grace doesn't just automatically get shed on people who are wonderful, but it's a restorative thing that we may need. And then when we sing, God bless America, God mend thine every flaw. There's some preaching material there. And when we, I think we need to take the patriotic stuff as providing us with teaching moments. I was when I was a kid in school, we sang My Country 'Tis of Thee every morning, in the land of the Pilgrim's Pride, land where my fathers died, and later on, I came to resent some of that stuff for some obvious reason, Pilgrim's Pride and the like. But my father's God, to the author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, And there are lines in there. Liberty with law, all of these lines. And I think we need to have a teaching ministry in the church that addresses these things. And I think we're seeing a massive failure on the part of the Christian church, certainly my kind of evangelical church. A massive failure. And Martin Luther King is a wonderful example here because he quoted all that stuff from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And he loved the patriotic expressions. And he used them to call a nation to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly before God. And I just think we've been a failure at that.
If I can just say two quick things in addition, appreciate what Richard just said. The first is to pose a question, which is being patriotic about expanding who we, the people, includes, or narrowing it and restricting it? And this kind of gets into the conversation about, I think, the dangers of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism often takes us in a direction of creating this false belief that kind of the true and the real Christians are white Christians, and, elevates a certain brand of Christianity, often at the expense of many of the diverse expressions and traditions of Christianity. And so, I think that how we practice patriotism is very much tied to how we understand who the we the people is and who it includes. And I think that ultimately what's more aligned with our civic and religious values is to want to be a part of the ongoing project of expanding who enjoys liberty and justice for all. The second quick point is that we have a battle going on over how we teach and understand our history. And I think it is a really, really significant one. And it's gotten more and more bitter over the last number of years, the last couple of decades. And if we don't have a shared baseline understanding of some of those shared core kind of ideals that are part of the American project, if you will, then it makes it very hard to have a common ground in which to engage in debate about a lot of tough, complex, thorny political issues. And I'll just give you one example of this. According to a lot of polling, over half of Christians do believe that we were founded as a Christian nation. And that completely defies our historical record. Yes, we were founded, many of the founders were Christian, not all of them, and many of them certainly wove Christian values into our Constitution. But we're very explicit about ensuring through the First Amendment that we would have a separation of church and state, that we would ensure our country enables a free exercise of religion, which both protects religion, but also helps protect the state. And so we've got these kind of myths, unfortunately, that are kind of distorting our understanding of our own history, but also kind of distorting some of the core values that I think make the building blocks for what America is and what it could be.
I found your comment about the Black church being patriotic interesting because, my impression is that most of those who have an aversion to patriotism tend to be on the left side of American politics. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that tends to be more the case. And yet, the Black church has been arguably the most powerful democratizing force in our nation's history. What kind of forced our nation to guarantee everyone the right to vote? It was, not just the Black church, but it was the leadership of the Black church in the Civil Rights Movement that fought not just for Black Americans, but for everyone. So, yeah, I think, again, like a really healthy understanding of patriotism is also understanding that we are willing to critique where our country falls short, and we're willing to sacrifice and to even fight to try to ensure that our country really truly lives up to those ideals.
Here's a question from the Q&A from the audience. Would Christians pre-Constantine have valued the idea of patriotism? How would they have connected it to their faith? Pre-Constantine, how would Christians pre-Constantine have valued the idea of patriotism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the earliest documents that we know of in the Christian tradition, very early, the people of Diognetus, and he was explaining this strange new religion to Roman authorities. And he said that we believe that every nation, that our nation is a homeland, and that he did that whole thing about we got to love other nations and the like. I think we found that early church struggling with diversity and sensing that God, the Christian community, to be embracing people of different languages, and a lot of the examples in the book of Acts point to that. So anyway,
I would just say that the closer we as Christians get to Rome, the further we often get away from the cross. And there's kind of this unhealthy infatuation with power, unfortunately, within many parts of our history, including today. And so early Christians, often even before they were known as Christians, were called the followers of Jesus, of the way. And they did not have a project to, quote unquote, make Israel great again. They had a project of following the radical values and teachings of Jesus. And unfortunately, when Constantine converted to Christianity and kind of made Christianity the religion of the empire, the Roman Empire, he, I think, weakened some of the, commitment and appeal of the Christian movement at that time. It kind of ended up losing some of its zeal and losing some of its integrity, etc. And so again, it kind of applying that to our current moment, if as Christians, our goal is power, no matter at what cost or through what means, then ultimately, I think that is not the way of the cross. Yes, we want to try to ensure that we can elect in a democratic system candidates that are going to kind of reflect our values. And from my understanding of my faith, that means kind of first and foremost making a commitment to protect the most vulnerable in our society and to protect the modern day widows, orphans, immigrants, and people living in poverty. And then we can disagree and should disagree as Christians on the best way to do that. There's lots of different systems and policies and laws that can get us to that shared goal. But it's almost as though we can't even agree on that shared goal. And then that much more difficult to have civil, healthy debate about the best ways to get to that goal. So if we're only pursuing power, then we get into this trap of idolatry and allowing our faith to be co-opted rather than for our faith to be salt and light that is transformational.
Yeah, you had pointed out earlier how our church-state separation, First Amendment, how it protects the church, but it's also good for the church. I mean, because whenever the church gets political power, it becomes corrupt. We've seen that time and time again throughout history. So thank you all. Thanks to both of our speakers for dealing with our technical difficulties and for staying late. For the audience, there'll be a survey once we log off. So please take a moment to take that survey. And before we leave, though, I'd like to, if either one of our speakers, Adam or Rich, if there are any last words you'd like to share for us.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Any final words before we log off?
I think I've said what I needed to say.
One, I just encourage you to check out Sojourners, sojourn.net. A lot more content that is very much speaking to this topic and broader topics of biblical justice. I'll end by sharing a quote. We both had referenced Dr. King, and there's a quote that is one of my favorites of his in one of his sermons. If you've never seen or read the book Strength to Love, I would highly recommend it. It's a compilation of Dr. King's greatest sermons. And in that book, one of the sermons has a quote where Dr. King says, "Our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority. And I know it's kind of a mouthful, but I really love this kind of dual concept and commitment of being creatively maladjusted to the brokenness that we see around us in our politics and in the church, what have you. But it's not just having a different mindset. It's also about, as John Lewis would say, being willing to get into good trouble so that we can put our faith into action in ways that can help get us closer to these ideals that we do hold dear, both as a country, but also as Christians. So just offer that up, and hope to meet some of you someday. And thanks Knapp and Emily and Richard to be in this conversation together.
And
Thank
thanks to
you.
everyone for your patience adjusting to all the technical issues. So thank you.
Yes. Have a great night, everyone. Please take the survey if you're an attendee. It's very short, quick. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night, all, and God bless.